This Columbian printing press was sent to New Zealand by the Church Missionary Society in 1842. It's a strikingly imposing bit of kit, a solid cast-iron construction ornamented with scrolls and gilding, and topped off with a ceremonial eagle bearing Jupiter's lightning bolts, the olive branch of peace, and a cornucopia of plenty in its talons. And this was more than just a work of art. It was one of the most modern and technologically sophisticated machines of its day. It, and the other iron printing presses developed in the early 19th century, were transforming the world of printing, transforming the way in which people communicated. This particular printing press was sent to the tiny, remote hamlet of Paihia in Northland, towards the north of New Zealand's North Island. Paihia was a mission station, and home to a missionary who was also a printer, a man called William Colenso. 11 years later, in 1853, another printing press was sent out to another Colenso, to William's cousin John Colenso, who had just been enthroned as the first Bishop of Natal in South Africa. This talk, then, is really about two objects, two printing presses, and it's also about two men, two Cornish cousins called Colenso. But above all, this is a story about the expansion of the Christian world in the 19th century, a period in which Christianity grew more quickly and spread more widely than ever before. This massive growth was precisely what John and William Colenso had each intended to achieve. It was what their printing presses were sent out to expedite. Yet, as we'll see, this was also a process that raised huge questions and presented huge problems. Problems and questions that are still with us today. Now, some of these problems were purely personal, for John and William Colenso each struggled in their new environments. Both fought with other missionaries and churchmen, both wrestled with the dilemmas that life in a new world presented them with. For William, it was his home life that caused most difficulty. Although his work as a missionary printer went well, and although he produced the first books ever printed in New Zealand, publishing works in both English and in Maori, he married unhappily and conducted an illicit affair with his wife's Maori maid. The result was a scandal that destroyed his career. For John, by contrast, a remarkably energetic colonial bishop with a deeply happy home life, the problems were more theological. The process of translating and printing Zulu Bibles contributed to his sense that Christianity needed to be rethought, that biblical literalism was, in fact, a sort of heresy. Only a decade after he arrived in South Africa, his views had become so radical that the Church sought to depose him as bishop and even expel him for heresy. The rest of his life would be a struggle to hang on to his office and sustain his reputation. In many respects, then, the twin narratives of John and William Colenso were a footnote in the history of the Church, just two more sad little stories to add to an already capacious collection. On the one hand, there's William, a Puritan who turned out, like most Puritans, to be a hypocrite, judging others lest he was judged himself. On the other hand, there was John, a man who, in the minds of his contemporaries at least, simply went native. But in reality, the story of the Colenso cousins and the printing presses they took with them tells us something rather more significant about Christianity then and now. In the first place, theirs is a story, much like ours, of globalization, of the creation of a world in which it matters to people in Europe what happens in Africa, in which events in New Zealand have repercussions at home. This global world still creates huge opportunities for the Church, but it presents enormous questions too. Not least, as both Colensos found, there was the issue of how to translate ideas into different contexts, how Christianity was reimagined by different cultures. In the second place, the story of Colenso's printing press reminds us of another tension created by this new globalized world. Both men adopted new technology with enthusiasm. Both were keen to use the printing press to convey a Christian message. But of course communication of this sort is a two-way process. It's not just that control of technology enabled William to escape an impoverished life in England, nor that it enabled John to become a major figure in his own adopted homeland. It's also that they themselves were changed by this, with John compelled to re-examine his most basic beliefs, and William forced to confront the dreadful contradiction between what he was printing and what he was actually doing. It's a strikingly contemporary sort of issue. How do we use modern forms of communication, modern technology, to convey a Christian message? What effect might that have on it, and on us? Finally, and perhaps most importantly, it's worth noting that this globalized, technologically sophisticated world presented major questions about church authority and Christian unity. Both these men struggled with authority, and authority struggled with both of them. The case of John Colenso is especially helpful in showing how a newly global church proved unable to impose a single unified approach, a single clear structure, a single coherent doctrine all across the world. And it's not clear that anything has changed. Instead of John Colenso, think of Gene Robinson. Indeed, just as the consecration as bishop of the openly gay Gene Robinson led to the idea of a single universal Anglican covenant, so the apparent heresy of John Colenso provoked the creation of the Lambeth Conference. Yet neither mechanism, not a single document, nor a single gathering of all the Anglican bishops, has been able to solve the problem of disunity, providing a global solution to a series of local problems. It's just that we now use the minimalist iPad instead of the maximalist, rather magical Columbian press to convey our ideas and advertise our arguments. Looking at Colenso's marvellous printing press, I'm not convinced that we can call that progress.